The poem was written on the 3rd of May, 1915, which would have affected it because this was during the war, meaning that John McCrae did not have the power of hindsight to affect his poem. It was written by a poet who was living in Britain at the time, which would have affected it because he knew Germany were planning terrors rather than being oblivious to it. It was written when poetry was modern, which would have affected it because it meant he knew the structure of poems well, since it wasn't a new concept, meaning he could express his feelings about the war perfectly, which he did. The poem was written around a year after the war started, which means that McCrae would have had some experience with the brutality of the war, yet not how slow, treacherous, and inhumane the whole war was. McCrae was 42 when the poem was written, which is very interesting since a lot of the soldiers were a lot younger than him. Because McCrae had more life experience, it meant he had longer time free than other soldiers did, and this meant he saw younger people dying, which would likely have made him realise there was no hope, which could have been why he wrote the poem in the first place. McCrae was from Canada, which likely would have meant the European grounds felt alien to him, and like a whole new experience, which was like no other. John also was a surgeon in the war, meaning he saw countless deaths and had to treat many wounds, and likely was what gave him the loss of hope and made him see the fate of all the soldiers right in front of his eyes.
So in the second line of the first verse, it says row on row, about the dead, how they're being stored. Just row on row, that's how many of them there are. In the third line, it says mark up place, gives connotations about how there's no going back and they're stuck in the field. In the fifth line of that verse, scares heard amid the guns below. It shows how overwhelming the war is. Then in the second verse, it says, "We are the dead," which tells us that the poem is from all of the people who are fighting. It's like similar to how when they say row on row, they're all like very similar, all like the same. Then straight after that, it says "short days ago," which says how their life as a soldier felt quick and in a way their death could feel inevitable. In the third line of that, it says, "We lie in Flanders fields." Flanders fields repeated in the last verse as well. This phrase gives Flanders fields a sense of being a burden, and because it previously said we loved and were loved and all that, shows now that that's a contrast to lying in Flanders fields. So then in the next verse it says, "Take up our quarrel with a foe." This is talking about how dead soldiers want the current soldiers to keep on going, like a race almost. Then after that, it says, "From failing hands." This could be talking about how the dead soldiers failed to stay alive, so they need the next soldiers to take their place, which is also signified by throwing a torch. In the fourth line, it says, "If ye break faith with us," it's as if their faith is the only thing keeping them at peace. And "we shall not sleep," it's a better way of saying lie dead and also more accurate. When it says poppies, it links to the start of the poem because at the start it was talking about how they signify the graves, and now it talks about how they won't sleep, yet the poppies will grow anyway.
I feel that a point of a poem is to try and express that the Great War is a bloodbath, and that every soldier has the same fate, and that fate is Flanders fields. I also feel that the poet wrote the poem to give an insight on how hopeless the soldiers were, as well as how their lives were so beautiful before the war, yet they had to end up in a Flanders field against their will. The poem also could be about encouraging as well as warning the next line of soldiers, since the third stanza talks about passing a torch, and the previous two stanzas could be to tell them what they were fighting for and how high the stakes were, as well as what the soldiers went through. However, I don't feel the poem was just to make the reader feel sad and the next soldier to feel not in control. It could be about how it could change with the next soldiers, since the dead soldiers failed to stay alive, and to give the new soldiers hope they wouldn't end up in Flanders fields.